What's poppin', people? It's Dante. Today I want to break down 3 photographs discussing composition in street photography. And so when it comes to composition in street photography, it sometimes comes secondarily as we're interested in the content. We're interested in the moment, the subject, the emotion, the thing itself. However, I believe in order to create a strong photograph, we must synthesize a composition with both strong content and form. And this is something we're going to break down today, looking at 3 photographs I made in Philadelphia, discussing some of my ideas around composition and how we can elevate our composition game out there on the streets, because this to me is something very difficult to achieve. And so at this scene, I'm observing as this boy is coming through the scene very quickly and spontaneously on a bike. He's doing a wheelie and his leg is in the air, and it was just a crazy quick moment that disappeared in a split second. But by being observant and being quick to respond to the scene and responding with my intuition, I was able to create this composition. And so I had 2 different chances to make this photograph. There were 2 boys. The first man came through and I didn't make a successful picture of him. The problem initially was that I was photographing at eye level. And because I was photographing at eye level, the wheelie was blending in with the background and I couldn't see that prominent decisive moment of the wheelie. And so the second time came around and I noticed how the boy was doing a crazy acrobatic move. And so I dropped low instinctively in order to separate the foreground and the background. And so this is something very important to highlight here, is the fact that when you're making a composition, ultimately it derives through your intuition, from your gut. You're not out there on the streets looking at leading lines. You're not out there on the street looking at shape and form. As much as you can observe these different nuances, you're very intuitive with the way that you approach composition. You're responding quickly. When I'm out there on the streets, I'm not looking at the life in front of me with my camera to my eye, okay? I'm looking at life in front of me with my eyes, and I'm responding with my gut. And I think this is the most important and critical thing to consider when it comes to composition, is that you must have a strong intuition and you must have the ability to respond quickly on your toes to whatever situation comes your way. And so with this particular moment, I responded with my toes and I dropped down low and I made sure to separate the foreground from the background and highlight this moment, separating it from that blue sky. For me, street photography and photography generally, and creating a composition, it's like visual problem solving. And the idea is where you position your physical body in relationship to the moment and the background is what ultimately decides the framing. It's what ultimately decides the result of the photograph. It's not very photographic. It's very much intuitive. It's something physical. And so by positioning my body and dropping down low and watching as the flow of the man came through, I was able to capture that decisive moment and freeze the action, and ultimately separating the frame very simply. It's a very minimalist composition. We have a moment and a background. We have one, okay? We have one here, and we have 2 here, and that's it. 1, 2. Moment, background. And this is something that is frequent on the streets. It's something that happens often. We see one thing, we see one subject, we see one moment, one character, one expression, and we want to make a photograph of that thing. But in order to make a strong composition of that content, you must have strong separation and form where the content and the backdrop synthesize within the frame. And so in order to do this, in order to make photographs with speed and spontaneity, in order to make something cohesive and something visually impactful and compositionally strong, I believe you must have this heightened intuition. And just watch how you see how the frame's broken up. It's very simple. Left-hand side, moment. Right-hand side, background. But luckily with this composition, through the intuition, the background and the foreground have a very interesting dynamic going on, as the gesture of the legs are almost the same shape of the background, which make the photograph, to me, this is what makes the photograph successful and strong, is the fact that the shape almost echoes the shape that it's surrounded by with the buildings in the sky. And so this is the first photograph and first idea I have about composition, and really honing in on responding with that intuition. You know, this is like a hunt, right? This is an example of hunting, right? Where I'm just quickly out there and I'm just looking for moments and boom, it comes my way. The next frame we're going to break down is something very different. This frame came through not just the intuition when I pressed the shutter and the stars aligned with the man in the light and the silhouette, but it came through being hyper aware of my background. It came through me being hyper aware and observant with the sharp visual eye of the light and the way that light and shadow interplay here. It came through me positioning my physical body at a choke point and fishing at the scene with patience. And so this is another technique that we can use when we're on the street, is through our patience and observation, we can set a stage and wait for the stars to align. And so here, the first thing that drew me in to make the photograph was in the foreground. I was drawn to the light. But not only was I drawn to the light, I was drawn to the bus stop. You know, the bus stop for me is a great place to practice layering and compositions. I find that when you're at a bus stop, there's so many different dynamics going on. As people are passing by the sidewalk, people are sitting inside, people are standing and waiting by the door. You know, there's a lot of different things that you can do at a bus stop. And I always found that by photographing at bus stops, I was able to find successful pictures here in Philadelphia. And so here at the scene, the light drew me in. And sometimes that's all it takes for me, is I find a good patch of light and I observe. And so here at this scene, I'm observant. I'm watching as people pass by on the sidewalk and the light is casting beautifully on their faces. I'm observant of the way that people are in the shadows. I'm observant of the way that light and shadow interplay at this particular scene. But I'm also hyper aware of the different elements that break up the frame. And so when I was walking around this bus stop, I made lots of different pictures from lots of different angles, and ultimately wound up positioning my physical body at this decisive moment in this particular way, because I wanted to break the frame. And so by breaking the frame from the left to the right, I was able to position that sign that I just highlighted on the left-hand side against the sky, being hyper aware of that shape, being hyper aware of the way that the light interplays. And then finally, as this moment unfolded naturally and spontaneously, this man in the center came into the light, and his gesture, it was a surprise and a delight, because it adds a bit more of mystery to the frame. It adds a bit more intensity, where the emotion is a bit more somber and he's looking downwards on his face. And then when you relate this to the foreground of the frame, it becomes filled, and the photograph now becomes this visual feast. So we have one element in the foreground, we have the moment in the middle ground, and then we have, of course, the background, being the stage that I set. And the way that I set this stage initially was by aligning and recognizing this particular sign over here. By recognizing that sign and seeing how it popped up against the sky, I made sure to have a very gradual and nuanced approach to the composition by moving my physical body in a particular way in relationship to the moments that were fleeting in front of me. And so this frame is a bit more complex, and things came together a bit more methodologically. Is that a word? What is the word I'm looking for? You know, I was using more intention. I was using more intention at this particular moment and at this scene. You know, I could really feel the potential to make a photograph here, and I could really sense the possibility because of the light, because of the movement. And so by positioning your body at a choke point like this, you can create a more cohesive and structured frame. Next, we have another image where I'm using light and shadow play. But when I approached this scene, it was very intuitive and quick. I didn't have time really to fish. This to me was using the hunting technique, where I'm observant and I'm really quick on my toes and I'm watching as the shadows are casted at the scene, and I approach and get very intimate and close to the scene. And so as I approached the scene, I was of course drawn in to these different elements in the frame with the light and the shadow. But to be honest with you, what I love about this location in particular, and the reason I photograph in Penn's Landing here in Philadelphia, is because when you photograph in Penn's Landing, you can always have a beautiful stage. Just look at the way that the beautiful background fills that part of the frame. You know, we have about 1/3 of the frame filled because we have a clean backdrop. And so when you approach a scene and you go to a certain location, recognize the way that you can utilize the background to your advantage when you're making photographs. And here on this particular day, I wound up having some nice shadows, and this interplay between light and shadow can become an element that adds more depth and layer to your image. And so, of course, this is something that I was intrigued by. But to make this photograph even more strong, I made sure to include the subject in the foreground. And so having a strong foreground element is critical. And so the gesture of the woman sucking on her, she had one of those like ring pops, I don't know, like those like candy pops, was interesting. And her gesture and her gaze leading your eye out of the frame, I believe, adds tension and drama. And so she's facing to the right-hand side of the frame, and then in the middle ground, you get delighted with these different shadows. And so her eye kind of leads you there. And then you have these different people that fill the frame in the middle of the picture. And so we have that second element, which is the shadow play. And these different things come together naturally. And one of the very fun and spontaneous elements that actually fell together through my intuition and through positioning my body in a particular way was here in the middle ground, where I delightedly made this relationship between the head of that woman and the sort of like a circular shape of the Ferris wheel. And so it's like a bullseye target where I line things up just right. And this happened through intuition. And so when you look at this frame, again, it's a bit more complex, and I'm on the hunt and quickly responding intuitively, but I'm understanding these different fundamental ways in which I can relate my physical body to the subject and the background to cohesively bring together both form and content. And so this to me is the art of composition in street photography. And ultimately, my philosophy around composition in street photography comes down to having a strong and heightened intuition. And so when you're out there and you're practicing your street photography, I highly encourage you to hone in on one camera and one lens. When you practice daily with that same setup, you're going to have such a heightened intuition that you're not going to have to think when you're at a scene. You're going to be able to analyze and understand how to relate these things quickly and intuitively on your toes. And so hopefully something here helps you on your journey of combining both content and form to make strong street photographs. This is something that comes with practice and time spent out there in the world, but hopefully through breaking down some of these pictures, we can learn and grow together and improve our composition. So thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more videos about street photography. Peace.